We've spent some time talking about different types of assessment and some considerations for assessing multilingual learners. In this video, we're going to transition to talking about what it means to take a multilingual or a heteroglossic approach to assessment. And essentially, both of these terms are getting at the idea that we shouldn't just be looking at our multilingual learners through a monolingual or what is sometimes called a monoglossic lens, which means just looking at what they can do in one language. The goal here is really to begin to push ourselves to think about our students more holistically and think about how we might reshape our assessments as a result. Now, a complicating factor with this is that we are currently living in the era of the standards-based reform movement, which has led to the rise of standardized assessments. Never before have students taken so many standardized assessments as they do now, because that has become the de facto measure of student learning and of school success or efficacy. And I like this political cartoon because I think it illustrates, the ridiculousness at times of the way that we approach assessments, and especially standardized assessments, but assessments in general. You can see here that, of course, it is not a fair exam for all of these animals to climb that tree, because some of the animals will need different supports if they're going to be able to do that. So we might need to rethink what the task is and what the goal is behind that ask. And yet so many times we view assessment through a one-size-fits-all lens, rather than think about what the core content learning and core language learning objectives or standards we have, and how we might evaluate students accordingly based on what they can do more holistically. And I also want to, excuse me, take a moment, also talk about the problem with some of the data that we gather and some of the ways we talk about assessment data. Here you see some of the charts from the 2022 RICAS data looking at MLLs in math and in language arts. And every time I see data like this, I get frustrated because it's important, as we talked about earlier this week, to think about what it is we really want to know, and what the data is able to tell us about what we really want to know. And in this case, we're looking at MLLs in third grade and MLLs in eighth grade who are meeting expectations in math and language arts. And from a first glance, you can see there's a gap between MLL students and non-MLL students. However, if you think about what this data represents, it's actually quite meaningless, especially the data around language arts, because MLLs, by definition, are students who are still acquiring grade level English. They are not currently proficient in English. That is why they are called MLLs. So, of course, we would expect them to be performing at a lower level in an English language arts test. As soon as a student who is an MLL becomes proficient in English, they are no longer an MLL. They exit that label, and thus their data would not be reflected here. That is why this data in many ways is telling the wrong story. Now, of course, we could argue with math. Certainly, yes, there's a gap that you need to think about addressing. But again, these assessments are given in English. And so we don't really know what our MLL students are capable of doing in other languages if we're only looking at what they can do in English. So even that data is flawed. And yet the story that we often tell with data like this is a story of failure, a story of students, a story of gaps, and a story of students not catching up, and of schools underperforming and not serving students. And that is not to say that schools don't have room for improvement, but there will never be a point when this data will show MLLs and non-MLLs at the same level in English language arts by definition, right? So think about that. And I encourage you to continue to be critical consumers of research. A much more useful and much more interesting data point was this data from that same RICAS year, which showed MLL students, non-MLL students, and recently exited MLLs, which is exactly that group we were talking about. Students who used to be MLLs, but now they have reached English proficiency. And this data tells an amazing story. Students who recently exited are outperforming non-MLL students in English language arts and math in this third grade example. That's an incredible story and shows actually that our supports for MLLs must be pretty good, because students are, they're not hitting the benchmarks of whatever the expectations are. They're still at 55% and 61%, but they are outperforming students who are not MLLs at all. So again, it is a mindset shift that I think is important to consider as we're talking about assessment and thinking about multilingual learners. A big picture idea that I want you to walk away from this week with is that we need to approach assessment for multilingual learners from a multilingual perspective. As we've talked about in this course, in relation to second language acquisition more broadly, we know that multilinguals always have access to their full language repertoire, and that they can leverage it flexibly and strategically to show us their learning. So when we're thinking about assessment, we should be approaching it from a multilingual perspective. Now, of course, it can be challenging to tap into, to fully understand what a student can do, especially when you're a teacher who may not speak your students' languages. But that doesn't mean you can't create spaces for students to show you what they can do across multiple languages, and have it be a part of your both formative and summative assessment process. And I want to show you one example of the power of tapping into students' multilingualism and bilingualism from a teacher I worked with who was teaching in a third grade dual language bilingual education classroom. Now, this is an example in a bilingual classroom with bilingual learners, so that's different than I know the context for some of you, but it does speak to the way in which a student's full linguistic repertoire can support their learning and show us what they can do in terms of assessment. So in this classroom, the third grade teacher was having her students learn about ecological systems, and she had students in pairs working on writing short reports about these different systems that they had learned about. So two students together, who were both Spanish dominant, wrote a text in English about this process that they had learned about how animals eat, or kind of the chain of what animals eat, and then going into decomposition. So you see the original text says the bunny eats the berries, then the fox eats the bunny, the wolf eats the fox. Then when the wolf is dead, the bacteria breaks down to the soil. You see this explanation here. They were then asked to translate their example into Spanish, and here's what they wrote. El conejo come las bayas, luego el zorro se come el conejo, después viene el lobo y se come el zorro, finalmente el lobo se muere y la bacteria lo rompe y se lo lleva a la tierra. And what I pointed out here, as you might be able to see, is that this translation actually is more linguistically complex. They used more transition words like luego, después, and finalmente. So different words for saying then, after, finally, and the way they described what the bacteria was doing, and that it was breaking it down and it was bringing it into the earth, is more complex than what they said in their first version. The teacher then asked them to go back to their English version and make any revisions that they wanted to based on the Spanish version they had created. And you see that they then went back and added in some of those transition words and revised that last sentence to be more complex. And this is the power of leveraging a student's full linguistic repertoire, that they were able to make connections and use more complex language that then supported their English language development. And I know not everyone is working in a bilingual context where the teacher speaks the languages of the students, and the students can work bilingually, but it's very possible still to make spaces like this for students to engage their full linguistic repertoire and to do so in a way that helps inform assessment. So I want to end this video with a quote that I think is just an important message to think about as we move forward into this section of the week, which is how can teachers leverage the assets of multilingual learners in their instruction and assessment. And I want you to sit with this and think about it as you read the two chapters, or the chapter and article for this section, and think about your own practice or future practice, how you might approach assessment from a more multilingual or heteroglossic perspective.